Welcome, and thank you all so much for coming. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples and pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today and to the traditional custodians of the land from which our online audience is joining us today. Girls in the World started as a passion project of mine and as a spin-off of the Girls Leadership Network. As someone who's always been fascinated by the inner workings of an embassy and diplomacy, I thought it would be really cool to see if we could get young women into spaces that they're traditionally not supposed to be. And I figured that if there were probably other young women like me out there who wanted to do the same thing. I wanted to see what would happen if we just asked embassies if we could send some young women to them for a day. And in our first year, we had 22 young women go to 11 different embassies. And now 5 years on, we've had over 100 young women go to over 30 different embassies. These young women have gotten the chance to sit in on working lunches with GFACs, write reports for capital cities, have one-on-one mentoring sessions with high commissioners, lunch with ambassadors, and spend time in the sauna at the embassy of Finland. Every time I see one of the agendas from a high commissioner and embassy, it's always so amazing to see all of the experiences that the participants get to have. And like it is the dream come true of my 13-year-old self who would have loved to do that in an embassy. But one of my favorite things about this program is that while the participants have an absolute blast, so do the embassies. They get so much out of being able to connect with young women and have young women in these spaces. I actually had somebody tell me that spending time with the young women from Girls in the World is their favorite part of the year because the rest of the year they spend it in sort of routine meetings. But it was so nice to spend time with young people who had so much optimism and hope for the world. And so 5 years after we started, we're launching the Girls in the World Network. The network will be a space for alumni and supporters of Girls in the World to connect and share opportunities. It will include panel events and meetups just like this one, as well as a LinkedIn group as a shared space. And I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you guys for your support. And that's what makes this program possible and has made it possible for the last 5 years. And with that, I'll hand it over to Nancy Schneider and our incredible panel guests to talk about their experiences constructing a modern state and to truly kick off the network. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Asha. My name is Nancy. I am the National Operations Manager with the Australia Institute of International Affairs. I'm also the editor of Australian Outlook, our online publication. Welcome to this evening, both to our in-person audience here at the National Office in Deakin and to our online audience tuning in from the comfort of their own homes. So tonight's topic is state building. State building in the modern world encompasses a vast range of processes of state creation, including the formation of government institutions, a national identity, and external and internal legitimacy. In the wake of conflict or crisis, the strength of a country's state building processes have long-reaching effects, ones that can span not just days, months, and years, but decades and onwards. So state building actions can define whether a state will succeed or fail in the modern international order, yet it's not without its challenges. State building is one of the most prominent drivers of modern day conflict. Here to talk to us about state building from their own perspectives, we have three experts who are involved in the creation of their own nations, Croatia, South Africa, and Afghanistan. Following their opening presentations, we will open the floor for questions from you, our in-person audience and our online audience. For those of you here in person, please raise your hand and we will do our best to get to you. Make sure that you say your name and any affiliation if you would like. Speak up because we do not have a roaming mic tonight. Then for those of you who are interested in asking questions online, please use the Q&A function that is at the bottom of your screen. We have the upvote feature turned on, so if you like a question that somebody else has asked, please do acknowledge that, and we'll do our best to get to the most popular ones. With that, I will hand the floor over to our first speaker, Ambassador Betty Pavelich of the Republic of Croatia. She is the ambassador to Australia, to New Zealand, and to Fiji. Ambassador Pavelich spent a significant portion of her life in Canada, where she served as Chief of Staff and Legislative Advisor to several Canadian members of Parliament. She returned to Croatia and joined the Croatian Foreign Service in 2005. And throughout the course of her diplomatic career, the ambassador has held a number of senior positions in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the Republic of Croatia. And she's represented Croatia in numerous negotiations of bilateral agreements between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. With that, I hand it off to you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Asha. It's great to always participate in an event organized by Girls Run the World. I think within the first year of my arrival in Canberra, I had an opportunity to meet you and to get involved. And while I haven't hosted an intern yet from Girls Run the World, I have had the opportunity to host many interns since I arrived, because we have one key requirement, and that's that they have to have Croatian heritage. So if anyone has Croatian heritage, please feel free to apply. I guess to tell you a little bit about myself, I wasn't in Croatia at the time that the country was being formed, so to speak. Although Croatia proper has existed since the 9th century, it was in 1991, June 25th, 1991, that Croatia actually officially declared independence. And that was after a referendum where 93 point, I believe it was 2% of the population voted to leave what was the former Yugoslavia. This was actually a constitutional right of the former states to self-determination, and Croatia and Slovenia then subsequently now what is the Republic of Northern Macedonia and Montenegro, Kosovo, all took advantage of that section of the constitution of the former Yugoslavia. I, at the time, so it all started May 30th, 1990, when the first multi-party parliament was constituted. And then after that, the decisions were taken about independence. I, at the time, was in Canada, fairly young adult. Started my career and was working in the Canadian House of Commons, first as a legislative advisor and then subsequently as a chief of staff for many, many years. 1990, I was the only staffer of Croatian heritage on what we call the Hill over there. And, you know, when Croatia declared independence, the Croatian community of which I was a part of which I had grown up in, my parents moved to Canada when I was 5 years old. They wanted to leave what was a communist system to give me a better life in Canada. You know, everyone thought, well, with independence, you know, things are going to be great again. And then the war started. And then we couldn't understand, why are we having to convince countries to recognize us? We have the right to self-determination, but we can't get countries to recognize us. So I, as among the younger generation of Croatian Canadians, along with a number of my friends who had just graduated from university, who were in different spheres, be it banking, communications, law, we began to lobby. We took over from what our parents and grandparents couldn't do because their knowledge of English wasn't as good as ours was. And we began to lobby the Canadian government for recognition, for assistance, for support to try to help stop the war. That was our modest contribution. We were not there on the front lines like our relatives were, like our friends were, and our family was. We were watching and feeling helpless, as I know many of my friends in Canada right now who are of Ukrainian heritage are feeling, because they want to do something, but they can't. Croatia at the time was also under an arms embargo, so we couldn't really defend ourselves. There were multiple challenges. Luckily, our Ukrainian friends are not in that same situation. But in those early days and after recognition, I I was exposed to many a Croatian politician. They would come and visit. My bosses would help in organizing meetings for them with Canadian government officials, with elected officials, trying to progress the relationship and provide some of that assistance, including eventually a decision on peacekeeping forces and recognition. And after Croatia established diplomatic relations and opened an embassy, by 1996, there was a young Croatian diplomat on her first posting in Ottawa. And as was the case with earlier diplomats, I and my office would offer assistance. Can we help you? Who do you want to meet? What advice can we give you? And we developed a great working relationship. And years later, she would go on to become the foreign minister of Croatia. Fast forward, we had stayed in touch, and the opportunity presented itself for me to go back and serve as an advisor to her. I had a great job in the Canadian House of Commons, good income. I had 3 young kids, and I was consulting with my then boss, who was a Ukrainian Canadian. And I said, Boris, what should I do? And I said, my parents think, this is what, it's our duty to go help the homeland. And he said, yes, it is. We all have a duty to go and help where we can. And we've been privileged to, to have these opportunities in Canada to learn, to see one of the greatest democracies in the world in action. And so now it's time to go and give back to the country that gave you life. And so I did that. I took the 70% pay cut and moved back, in a whole different system, learning how to adapt because the whole system was adapting and evolving. It was, the war had ended. Croatia's territory was fully reintegrated by 1998, which unfortunately is, not everyone has that benefit. So we had embarked on this process, before I had even gotten there, on joining those international organizations that would take us to where we are today. So it was, from early on, of course, the UN in '93, I believe it was, but the goal was to join NATO, the EU, still the OECD, which we're working on 30 years later. But it was such a tremendous honor to be part of that process of undertaking the reforms to develop and change the whole system, reforming our military, our defense sector with, and my colleague Sandra here, she worked on the EU side of things. EU, not my area of expertise, so please don't ask about the EU, but the transatlantic anytime. But it was about working to harmonize our legislation, our laws, our practices with those laws of other European countries, because, Croatia wanted to rejoin its European family. And so that was what we were working towards. And you're going to have to cut me off because, I can keep going, but it was, I've got a minute. Okay. But it was really a great honor to work on the NATO accession process, to be the point person for relations with Canada, the United States, to work on advancing that bilateral relationship, negotiating bilateral agreements, from air transport agreements to getting rid of visitor visas, to continuing to work with those politicians that I had actually worked with in Canada, but to be able to explain things to them in a different way, in a way that perhaps had not been explained to them before. Because language, and that's one thing anyone wanting a career in diplomacy has to know, is that, you need to be able to understand what other people are saying. You need to be able to effectively communicate with them, not perfectly, but the more languages you know, the better you will be accepted. And I, as a kid growing up in Toronto, never thought that I would ever, when I was crying because I didn't want to go to Croatian school on Saturday, I never thought that I would get to use my Croatian. And then, all of a sudden you find yourself in a room and you're translating for a prime minister, and you're, sitting around a table negotiating with people in your language. So, never underestimate how important that element of language from your culture is to just a career in a global environment. So like I said, I could go on, but I will stop here.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much, Ambassador. I'm really excited to hear more about your experiences through our discussion. Next, we are going to hear from Pavelich Pillay. Pavelich is a partner at Ernst & Young, and her experience covers the public participation program in the writing of South Africa's post-apartheid democratic constitution. She also is involved in digital transformation in government in Australia. Pavelich holds a Bachelor's of Commerce from the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa and has a 20 plus year career as a consultant working with the governments of South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia. Go ahead, Pavelich.
Thank you very much, Nancy and Asha. And it's just so wonderful to get to spend a long and busy week with you and just to be encouraged by seeing so many young women and men here and wanting to hear these stories. And I think it can be at a more opportune time as you see fledgling countries trying to fight for their own democracy, and having lived through one where it moved from apartheid to a post-apartheid democracy. So I'll talk a little bit about my experience, and I remember in South Africa, and Betty, you mentioned you kind of had the fight from the outside, and I remember in South Africa we used to always talk about those that stayed and had to fight within, but equally important, those that actually went into exile. And, most people will know in South Africa, Nelson Mandela, who stayed and was imprisoned. But many people would remember the name of, Oliver Tambo. Oliver Tambo fought the South African war in many respects from the outside, whether it was from London, from Zimbabwe, or from many other countries. So I think those experiences are equally important in bringing about change. So my experience was having grown up in South Africa, living through those apartheid years. And at the time, you never know whether you're living through the ending of it or just being part of it. And I do remember when I was at university, there were, at that time, Nelson Mandela was imprisoned. He would have probably been just over 20 years. He'd been on Robben Island for a long time, and was moving into Victor Verster. And many people did not know what he'd look like. Everyone had photographs of what he was when he was captured and put into prison, or very famously put on the dock in the Rivonia trial, which many people would know was the trial that imprisoned many people through and charged them with treason. And I remember us doing little skits of what would he look like. And we would have never imagined that within our lifetimes, we would firstly see him released. So I was in university, so it would have been 85, 86, 87. He was released in 1990. So within 3-4 years of that, we got to see him. And, it's just incredible to think about it now, so many years on, when I was a young activist at university, kind of living and thinking, what is he going to look like? Would we ever see the ending of apartheid? When I went to university, the year before me was the first lot of students, if you were a child of a person of color, that we didn't have to apply to go to what was called a white university. So I was only the second intake. And the fact that I can sit here today, so even though apartheid is well and truly dead, it's not that long ago. Yeah. It's within my lifetime. So it's amazing to see that progress. And I think what was interesting about the process in South Africa was a combination of things. One was, a fight for the rights of people to liberate people, to enfranchise people to get the vote. But it was equally about freeing South Africans who probably voted for the National Party, not necessarily by choice. I mean, of course, they're responsible for the actions they took, but they were as trapped as those that never had the vote. And many people since then, whether you think of the likes of Joe Slovo, Ruth First, and not sure whether some of these names resonate, but stalwarts who probably belong to what would have been considered the privileged class, who gave up what that privilege might have been and worked alongside the African National Congress to bring about that change. The other part of the struggle in South Africa is the struggle, the women's struggle, the youth struggle, and there's so many dimensions of that struggle. There's obviously such iconic figures in whether it was Albert Luthuli, who was one of the first people to receive the Nobel Peace Prize from South Africa, or Nelson Mandela, or Bishop Tutu. There were a whole lot of women that equally fought that battle. And one of the things that was very clear in the lead up to the democratic election in South Africa, at that stage, prior to that, I was at university, as part of the democratic movement, as part of what they called the United Democratic Front, which formed and kind of almost, we were starting to get a sense that there will be change, or wanting to bring change from inside. At that time, we were very clear that to go for and enfranchise people, in going for dismantling apartheid, we also wanted to make sure that women had a voice. So in the lead up to the first elections in '94, South Africa has what you call a list system in terms of how you elect people to parliament. Every third candidate on that list was a woman. So this is in 1994, when we had 30% or 33% of the parliament were women. Probably very, very few countries around the world at that stage had that many people or that many women in parliament. And I think that does help in determining what a constitution was going to do, but also what the rights of a society were going to be. The democratic constitution, that process was interesting. It was going to be one not put down on people. We had to bring together, and this is, I think, the incredible legacy of Nelson Mandela, of wanting to bring together a nation. And Bishop Tutu's word of bringing the rainbow nation together was bringing the very, very far right to the very, very far left together to frame what is a constitution. It was not so much about a smokes and mirror, well, we can keep everyone happy. It was very determined by, we will do the right thing. Prior to 94, in 95, when we did the constitution, it was in 95, in the early 90s, just after the ANC was unbanned and people returned from exile, there was a very senior person in the African National Congress that was assassinated by the name of Chris Hani. And everyone wanted to say that he would get the death penalty. But Nelson Mandela and many others stood up and said, no, we're not going to do that. If you had to take to the popular vote whether South Africa should have a death penalty, it probably would have been the vote said we should have a death penalty. So there was a very, very clear and deliberate thing that we would do and implement things that were for human rights. And so the person who did assassinate Chris Hani got a life imprisonment, much to the disgust of a lot of people in South Africa having committed such a crime. But it was the right thing to do. And similarly, when we worked on the Constitution, it was looking at what women's rights were going to be, because at that point there was customary law. And does the Constitution support customary law or women's rights to land? And in the Constitution in South Africa, it has a lot more where women's rights are equal, if not higher, than the ability to apply customary rights. And I could go on many, many different layers of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. The part that's interesting in South Africa as well was around the use of plain language in the writing of South Africa's Constitution. Even though many years since, the Constitution's now going into its third decade, the Constitutional Court still remains. And even though there's been lots of corruption in some of the middle years, there's been a lot of really interesting processes that still have stood the test of time and hopefully will do. And I'll probably share a little more as we ask some questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Commentary. Finally, we are going to hear from Nematola Pijan, who is a lecturer in the Development Policy Center at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU. He is also a senior research associate with the Global Economic Governance Program at Oxford University and has had several roles with Oxford University over the past several years. Dr. Bijan's research covers public policy, international development, political economy, state building, and legitimacy in situations of fragility and in post-conflict reconstruction. Nematola contributed to development programs and reforms that helped Afghanistan's immediate post-2001 recovery. He served as Afghanistan's Youth Deputy Minister, founding director of general policy for and monitoring of Afghanistan National Development Strategy, head of the Secretariat for the Joint Coordination and Monitoring Board, and director of the General Budget at the Ministry of Finance. With that, I will hand it over to Namat.
Thank you, Nancy. So wonderful to be here and to be part of this wonderful panel. And I thank girls around the world leadership, especially Asha. Yeah, it reminds me of my time when I was a university student, a medical student. I was a youth civil society activist under the Taliban rule. I'm talking about 1990s. So we had a totalitarian state or government in Afghanistan. Even women were banned from work, going to work, and access to education. Coming fast forward to 9/11, what happened? Because that had to do something with Afghanistan. After the tragic events of 9/11 in the US, the US military intervened in Afghanistan and in alliance with the local resistance forces, removed the Taliban from power. That opened up or changed the political situation or regime in Afghanistan, and a new political order was established in Afghanistan. So basically concerning the values, it was opposite to what we had before. I gave two examples in terms of the fundamental rights. I and many of other fellows, especially young generation, we saw it as an opportunity that we can contribute and be part of a process that can help post-Afghanistan's recovery after conflict, build institutions to sustain peace and development, and more importantly, to let people to decide about the future, about their leaders. For the first time, I joined the government. It was the finance ministry, and I was not sure because I didn't have in mind to ever work with a government in Afghanistan, because governments were seen as part of problem, not a solution, or seen as illegitimate. Corruption, repression, and there was disconnect between government and people. The changes offered a wonderful opportunity. It was a time of hope and revival. In my case, and many other youth who joined the government, we want to do as much as we could to contribute as a volunteer and different capacities. So I focused on programs such as development program at the Ministry of Finance, and later on started working on policies and reforms. But the issue was, the main challenge was that one was that we could see the immediate impact, and there was high demand for that, but also lots of challenges, which I can pinpoint about those. The interesting part was about the new values that the new government committed. So at least 3 set of principles were something that the new government or regime committed to, but they were local values to appreciate diversity of people in Afghanistan. We have different ethnic groups, different languages in Afghanistan. And second one was also religious values, moderate values. And the third one was democratic values or principles, and allowing people to vote and decide about their future and about their leaders. But also the changes, post 2001 offered another opportunity which we missed, especially the previous regime excluded women from any sort of political participation, limited the access to education. It was difficult for a girl to go to school after year 6, which is now again imposed by the same, government, which took, the power by force after August last year. So it offered an opportunity for women to politically participate in a state building process. And in particular, the new constitution offered opportunities to encourage positive discrimination. 30% of our parliament was located exclusively for women. So we had relatively the highest percentage of political participation by women in Afghanistan in comparison to our neighbors. And also, this situation offered an opportunity to women to participate in design of institutions. So those institutions could accommodate the basic needs of women, girls, and appreciate their concerns, and also coming to budget and resource allocation. Even we had a unit and also a section called the program Gender Budgeting to be more sensitive to the needs of women in Afghanistan, especially because of the past history, what happened in Afghanistan. But also this process was not an easy one. So for 2 decades, the progressive achievements in Afghanistan has been impressive, coming to girls' education, access to health services, political participation, freedom of media, and so on. But also we encountered a number of challenges as a result of what the regime collapsed, the republic last August. I pinpoint a number of challenges, so I will call them capacity and governance, and legitimacy and security, in particular in the case of Afghanistan. And also I would like to mention that when we are talking about Afghanistan and about the state building, so we're not talking about building a new state. So we're talking about post-failure after disintegration of a state, rebuilding the state institutions, as we were dealing with both building new institutions and also rebuilding the existing ones, or reforming the existing ones. That was the situation in Afghanistan. So one challenge we faced that affected later on the situation in Afghanistan was institutional design. It was quite important what types of institution a nation could have, whether it reflects the realities of a society or not. One challenge, we got a highly centralized, personalized state in Afghanistan, personalized I mean that one person comes and makes all the decisions. That hindered the, state building process. Second, the state capture. Another challenge in Afghanistan, many other countries, we are facing state capture. A group is coming, capturing the state, key positions, and affecting national agenda. I had a chat before about Mandela. Mandela had a political will. We lacked that political will in Afghanistan. Leaders manipulated the system. Leadership, another one, and also absence of a committed leadership or champion. I would call it in situation of democratic state building. The absence of Democrats or democratic leadership will hinder the process. Coming to governance, corruption and patronage is a major problem. So what's happening? Political leadership uses resources, budget, in return for political support, granting contracts to friends and those who offer political support. That hinders state building because resources are limited. Another issue I would like to pinpoint is resources, lack of resources, especially at the initial stage of state building. You need money to fund programs or to build roads, fund schools, but you don't have that money because of war and so many other problems. Mostly these countries, as was the case in Afghanistan, relied on foreign aid, and foreign aid comes with its own problems. So above 50% of the budget was financed in Afghanistan by aid from different donors. Another factor I would like to mention, especially as we discussed in panel, is external actors. Despite the fact whether how much capacity, human capacity, institutional capacity exists in a country, or how committed a leadership could be, your neighbors or regional actors matter. They can undermine everything, as was the case in Afghanistan. The region got together to change the regime in Afghanistan. Why was that? Because of the presence of the US and NATO. They opposed that. Ultimately, Afghanistan paid the price. There could have been a transition or in a smooth manner. NATO could withdraw from Afghanistan, and also there could have been a reconciliation between the insurgents and the republic. And finally, I would like to mention that when we're talking about the state building, one of the problems is institutions can't solve all the problems in a society. We have different needs, identity, culture, and it's quite a difficult process, especially do the state building projects, which neglects nation building will have less chance of success. So coming to the first point I mentioned, the realities and needs and aspirations of a society should be addressed by any state building project. I stop here.
Thank you so much. No, that's exactly the right place to stop, because my first question to the three of you follows directly on from that. For Nemat and for Pamantri, you come from countries that have very, very deep internal divisions, that are societies that are have very diverse societies and different groups of people. How do you create institutions that take into account that diversity and that create conversation between groups that may not necessarily want to get along, may have committed acts of violence against one another? And for Betty, if you could talk about being a diplomat in a context with other states, I'm thinking of the former Yugoslavia, that there is a lot of division in your histories. How, as a diplomat, do you navigate that?
Do you want them to go first?
Yes, sorry.
Okay. Thank you. So the whole question comes to a social contract. We shouldn't, assume that or predict that institutions can be a mega solver of all problem of societies. And it's so difficult to transpose import or export institutions, while you can do, let's say, capital. That's why we need to appreciate that state building is a political and historical process. As you mentioned at the beginning, it takes time. And we need to recognize that and be patient. What's happening, mostly the leaders would like to show quick results. So they have short horizon about development, institution building. And so when it comes to institutions, how can institutions reflect the needs of society? There could be two approaches. One is to have a state that can represent the entire society, bring the leaders in the center, or the other way, let the provinces or periphery be the reflection of the power, either decentralize it or make it inclusive and representative. And that process needs leadership and political will. As you're talking about Mandela, so we are missing Mandela in our world. And without leadership and political will, the process can be captured, manipulated, and will lose its legitimacy. So another factor that's coming is legitimacy, how a process can be seen as a legitimate or accepted. Then we will support the outcome, or we will welcome the outcome of any process.
There's so many different answers to this question. I'll probably just give you a few examples. In bringing people from the very right to the very left who would have, outside of the process killed each other. One of the things I worked on in the Constitution was more around the public participation program. And we had many layers to it. One was an education process. How do you get people to participate in the Constitution making process if they didn't necessarily know what a Constitution was about? So we had that dimension. The area I personally worked in was where we took the politicians out to the people and to organs of civil society and got a dialogue going of what was important in a constitution. We held about 13 public hearings ranging from business, labor, youth, women, custodial, traditional owners of the land. There were 13 of those hearings. And I remember facilitating the one with youth, which was in 1995, the year that South Africa won the Rugby World Cup. And I was sitting trying to get this group together who the night before were going to threaten to kill each other in that session, but having both representatives of the different parties present, and the fact that their voices would be heard, and it wasn't just a tick the box exercise of participation, manage, and also the spirit of the time of trying to bring countries together really helped bring people together. Cyril Ramaphosa, who is the president of South Africa today, was the chairperson of the Constitutional Assembly, and he particularly goes to leadership, had the stature and clarity of purpose of how he was going to negotiate with the right, the left, and bring people together. They may not like what you're going to say, but they respected the fact that he would listen to both sides and make a decision. The other parts and examples I could give of some organs is, whilst the constitution process is really, really important, it was also transforming other organs of civil society that could hold the government to account. And that is really important, and I think is part of even though there's things going on in South Africa that probably has been challenging and there has been the corruption, those organs of civil society exist. And the third thing I'd point to is part of the healing process was the importance of having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that had to face the atrocities that were committed during apartheid. And I remember that every night at 7 o'clock, the hearings, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings, would be broadcast on television into the houses of everyone, which meant you couldn't avoid it. You had to confront what had happened. But the idea was not about just about jailing people. It was as much about the reconciliation as it was about the truth.
Interesting. Definitely interesting. So, with respect to, in diplomacy, I think I approach diplomacy from that perspective that you need to respect everybody. And if you want to have meaningful dialogue, if you want to achieve anything, if you want to reach consensus and move forward, it's not going to come from being belligerent. It's not going to come from disrespecting someone. So I work very closely with colleagues from the countries of the former Yugoslavia. I've had that opportunity in various places, including at NATO. I just, when you brought that question up, I thought to myself about my Slovenian colleague who used to sit directly across the big table from me. At the time, there were 28 member states, and we would coordinate our positions on certain things. And we'd even developed sort of this signaling, like baseball, with American baseball. So, we would so even though we had bilateral issues, it didn't prevent us from working towards things that were really, really important. You'll hear sometimes from other diplomats from other countries in the region saying, "Oh, how did you address that?" Or, "Boy, we wish we could do that." Diplomats are still people. They're not always, aligned or in agreement with what their political leadership is saying and doing. But at their core, they're working towards, for the best interests of their country and the greater good. And I think it's always good in diplomacy to look for that, low hanging fruit. What can we agree on and what can we build on? And, the countries of the former Yugoslavia, I grew up in Canada where I had friends who were from all of the former republics. And, the one thing that united us was that, well, we were different from all the Canadians, let's say, and we could relate in some way. And our parents didn't speak, the language very well. And, we had to go to the various different Sunday schools and that. So, again, it's that finding that commonality, and that is a key in diplomacy. Now, like I said, it doesn't mean we agree on everything. I think, we've seen when we were at NATO and when Macedonia and Montenegro, now Northern Macedonia, were working towards accession, Croatia and Slovenia were their biggest supporters. We always used to say that it would be our hope that Serbia would also join us at some point, but they've chosen a different path. Their path is not NATO. I don't want to get into too big of a debate, but there will always be differences, but really diplomacy is all about trying to find that lowest common denominator and building on that from there.
It's wonderful. One thing that I've learned being engaged with the diplomatic community through this role with the AIIA is that we are in fact all people, and that is that we have in common. I would really like to open the questions up to the floor now. Does anyone here have a question that they would like to pose to our speakers?
So this is probably particularly for me, Pavelich. So when Croatia was first becoming a country, how did you decide on the borders? Like, how are the borders of countries determined? Because I know that Croatia's border extends a long way down the coast, cutting off most of Bosnia and Herzegovina's access to the sea. How do you decide on that as being one country and not another?
Well, I think it's important to know that there were constitutionally recognized borders for each of the republics. So just like here, you've got, you know exactly what the state of Victoria is, you know exactly what WA is, and if WA were to secede, they would know exactly what belonged to them. So this was clearly defined in the constitution of the former Yugoslavia. So Croatia declared independence based on those borders, and that was what we were wanting to be recognized as. Those were the territories that we were fighting to protect and to maintain, just like Ukraine is trying to protect its territorial integrity in clearly defined international borders. Now, with Bosnia and Herzegovina never had access to the sea. So the current access that they do have was actually part of the Dayton Peace Agreement. So that was carved out as part of the peace negotiations so that they could have access to the sea. So that's really the, as far as borders go, borders are well known. Now that's to say, there are issues over maritime borders, that's always a tricky thing, but it's fairly cut and dry most of the time.
Would any other speakers like to weigh in on that?
No, I think this.
All right. Any further questions from the audience?
This is probably a bit more broad, but just along the lines of the constitutional law. But in what ways do you think the constitutions can be undervalued in their application in ways that are surprising? I think people don't often realize they have the power to influence lives. And in terms of that, I wish.
I'll repeat that question just for our online audience. What are the ways that the Constitution affects lives, individuals' lives within a country? What are the surprising things in that process? And go ahead, Mentor.
Oh, look, it's so the Constitution of South Africa got adopted in '96, and we're sitting in 2022. And if I think about no death penalty, the right for women to choose what happens to their body in the Constitution, and it's a combination of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the ability to recognize people irrespective of their sexual orientation. Those are kind of foundational things that determine the way in which that society functions. It drives what legislation will then get formed to give effect to a lot of those constitutional rights. And I think it does determine how your democracies would function. There is, I was reflecting with a colleague who worked with me in the Constitutional Assembly in 2018, and we were reflecting on our process and how engaged we were around constitutional education. And just post the writing of the Constitution, there was a lot of constitutional education going on. I do think that we in South Africa have not done enough to keep that constitutional education going, so young people understand the value of what was created at the time and how important that is in both creating a society and a nation, but our sense of values that belong and will prevail in everything you do. So there's no, I definitely think you constantly have to continue that education as generations evolve and change. But I think some of what a constitution does is enduring. And that's what the difference is between making a legislation that can be changed by the next group of people that come into parliament versus a constitution that should be enduring.
I can jump in. I guess a couple of points. In our constitution, for instance, let's just take gender equality is a fundamental right, and that then permeates everything that we do, from our domestic policy to our foreign policy to our security policy. So there's always that element of thinking about how will this impact women. Minority rights also very important, because you want to ensure that you're protecting everyone, and we do have ethnic minorities in the country. There's a unique element in our constitution that actually says that we have to protect and look out for the interests of Croatian communities, including and especially in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where Croatians are constituent peoples in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So yes, it's another country, but it's a country to which we are a signatory of the Dayton Peace Accords. So we actually have a very important role to play. And that, even to this day, is something that Croatia as a country is very focused on, because the Croatian population in Bosnia-Herzegovina is having its rights, electoral and voting rights, infringed upon. So this is something that, for instance, Croatia to this day is still working towards, working within international organizations, working with the EU, working through NATO, working through every possible international organization you can think of, is to ensure that Croatian, the constituent peoples of Bosnia-Herzegovina who are of Croatian origin are not disenfranchised. So just, I'll leave it at that.
Coming to the case of Afghanistan, the constitution was as a blueprint for governance. So it was quite detailed, not only included the principles and values the government committed to, such as protection of human rights, inclusiveness, and so on, but also it included items about how to elect the government, appoint the ministers, and also rule of women, gender, and even budget. So saying that, and also natural resources, how that could be managed and where the revenue should go, and transparency, accountability. It affected all us, I mean, people at different levels after 2001, even about freedom of expression and so on. It included items about those. And then we had a constitution committee to interpret the constitution, because often there could have been dispute about the constitution, and people would politicians would go and could be referred to that committee to validate their demands. That's why it was quite important. And also, more importantly, what I mentioned about nation building, it gave the people a sense of nationhood. It recognized their diversity, different languages, called them national languages, formal languages, and recognized their differences and also exist. And that's why it was quite important. It was not only something crucial for state building project, but also for the state building project in Afghanistan. Sadly, which is now dismantled by the existing de facto government of Afghanistan.
Well, I recognize that it is now 7 o'clock, and so our scheduled time is up. We could be here all evening talking state building, talking about your experiences. But I will have to end this session here. I would like to thank our 3 fantastic speakers, Ambassador Betty Pavelich, Pimentre Pillay, and Dr. Nematola Fijan. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences, for sharing your knowledge, and for being here this evening. Thank you to our online and in-person audience. It's fantastic to see every single one of you here. And thank you to Asha Clementi of Girls Around the World. Thank you to Ritu Clementi of the Girls Leadership Network, both for all of their efforts in organizing this event, but also for the fantastic spread of snacks and drinks that they have here tonight. Thank you to everyone who asked a question. Thank you to everyone who thought of questions. Please give those to your speakers afterwards. We will be here for a little while after this. Thank you to the National Office interns who helped set everything up today. the AAA is a membership organization, so if you enjoyed this event, please do check out what we're doing here in Canberra. We have a very active branch, and we want to see more young people involved. You guys are the future of this field, and your interest in international affairs is of great value to us. We want to support that in every way we can. So I encourage you to check out our other events, see what's happening, and I hope to see you here again very soon. Finally, final thank you to everyone here, and have a wonderful night.